January 1965, a curious sight unfolded on NHL ice. A young Swede named Ulf Sterner stepped onto the rink for the New York Rangers, becoming the first European-born and trained player ever to play in the National Hockey League. His stint only lasted a handful of games, leaving barely a trace. North American coaches and fans largely felt he lacked the toughness to compete in the NHL, despite his speed and his skating ability. At the time, hockey's Premier League was an all-Canadian and a few American domain, and the thought of Europeans thriving in this rugged environment seemed far-fetched. Yet, over the next few decades, a hockey revolution would unfold. Europeans would not only break into the NHL, but they would transform the game itself. But how did we go from European players being largely overlooked, labeled as soft, to become superstars who would dominate highlight reels, shatter scoring records, and lift Stanley Cups as captains? Well, that answer isn't that simple, but a long journey in hockey's history. See, in hockey's early decades, Europe and North America were like two different planets. The NHL, from its 1917 founding through the original Six era, drew almost exclusively from Canadian talent. Across the Atlantic Ocean, however, nations like Sweden, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union developed their own hockey traditions and stars, but few in North America really paid any notice. The rare European, like Sterner, was met with skepticism. Canadian hockey culture prized grit and physicality above all, and European players were branded as soft. They were mocked, chicken Swede, to mock the Swedish style of play, which was viewed as skilled, but didn't have the hard-nosed North American standards. Change began in the 1970s, however. In September 1972, during the Summit Series, an 8-game showdown between Canada's NHL stars and the Soviets. Team Canada, expecting an easy victory, was stunned by the Soviet speed, conditioning, and finesse. The USSR nearly won the series, forcing Canada to scramble to a narrow victory in the final game. The message was clear: European players possessed world-class talent and toughness in their own right. Toronto Maple Leafs scout Jerry McNamara, who discovered Salming in Sweden around that time, later remarked that the Summit Series opened a lot of eyes. "We realized, holy smoke, these guys can play." That same year, another quiet revolution was underway in Sweden. Two of the country's top players, Börje Salming and Inga Hammerstrom, secretly inked contracts with the Toronto Maple Leafs during the 1973 World Championships. When Salming arrived in the NHL for the 1973-74 season, he stepped into a culture still openly hostile to Europeans. In visiting arenas, fans taunted him as chicken Swede, and opponents tested him with vicious hits and slashes. The league's reigning bullies, the Philadelphia Flyers, prided themselves on intimidating tactics that Europeans didn't do in Europe. That wasn't hockey, and I quote. But Salming, a wary yet fearless defenseman from a remote town in Arctic Sweden, was determined to prove he belonged. Salming dropped the gloves in a scrum with the infamous enforcer Dave the Hammer Schultz, earning immediate respect from teammates and foes alike. Night after night, he absorbed abuse, but never backed down, blocking shots and even engaging in occasional fights when provoked. Salming's greatness was that he changed the way European players were perceived. One tribute noted, he dispelled the very notion of chicken Swede and redefined toughness. By the time he was voted an NHL All-Star and later became the first European inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame, Salming had flung the door open for others like him. But why had Canadians once doubted the European players? And what made the European game different? The answers lie in the different hockey cultures that evolved through the 20th century. In Canada, and of course the USA, the sport was played on small rinks, where action was tight and pushing. The NHL rink left little room to maneuver, so North American players emphasized speed, directness, and physical confrontation, finishing a check, battling along the boards, and dumping the puck deep to chase and hit. These were the bread and butter tactics. Fights were, and still are, relatively common in the NHL, and celebrated by fans and media. Across the ocean, rinks are much wider, about 200 feet times 100 feet, making it about 15 feet wider than the NHL dimensions, and a different style flourished. With more space and time, European hockey became a game of fluid passing, tactical patience, and technical precision. In the USSR, for example, the sport was almost like a science. The Soviet Red Machine operated through systematic training, creative playmaking, and a collective style that treated the ice like a chessboard. The emphasis was on puck possession and skill, not sheer brute force. European players and coaches generally discouraged upon fighting. A player who started a fight was ejected, and his team was penalized, which served as a strong deterrent in Europe. As a result, over-physical intimidation was rarer in Europe, and players focused on outskating and outsmarting opponents rather than outmuscling them. These two different psychologies set the stage for both conflict and cross-pollution once European and North American hockey truly began to intermingle. These early encounters, like the Summit series, showed each side aspects of the game they hadn't seen before. By the late 70s, these lessons began to show in the NHL. The World Hockey Association, or WHA, a rival pro league launched in 1972, accelerated the change. Desperate to compete with the National Hockey League, the WHA actively recruited European talent by the mid-1970s, especially players from Sweden and Czechoslovakia, who were eager to test themselves in North America. The Winnipeg Jets became a pioneering hub of European integration. They signed Swedish forwards Anders Hedberg and Ulf Nilsson, alongside Czech star Václav Nedomonski, pairing them with the legendary Canadian Bobby Hull. The chemistry was magical. That line tore up the WHA, and the European speed and finesse meshed beautifully with Hull's scoring touch to form one of the best lines in all of hockey. Winnipeg's success proved that Europeans could not only belong, but excel alongside Canadian greats. Other WHA teams followed suit, bringing in talents like Swede Andres Kalur and Finn Veli-Pekka Katsola. When the WHA ultimately folded in 1979, the 4 teams, including Winnipeg, merged into the NHL and brought their European stars with them. Initially, some of those players faced some old doubts in the NHL's higher profile arena, but the tide was turning. Through the early 1980s, NHL clubs, especially those not purely built on bruising and brawling styles, began giving more opportunities to European players. These cultural barriers were still high, particularly from players from communist Eastern Europe, as getting from the communist Iron Curtain to the States proved to be a challenge itself. Even so, by the 1980s, roughly 50 European trained players had seen NHL action. That was a staggering number compared to the 2 players a decade earlier. The influx had truly begun. At the dawn of the 1980s, a dramatic political defection made headlines around the world. In the summer of 1980, brothers Peter and Anton Šťastný from Czechoslovakia slipped away from their national team and made their way to Quebec City to join the NHL's Nordiques. Peter Šťastný was a revolution, a gifted playmaker who would go on to tally well over 1,000 points in his career, and astonishingly, the second highest scorer of the entire 1980s, behind only Wayne Gretzky. The Šťastný brothers' impact showed that even under restrictive regimes, Europe had world-class stars capable of dominating the NHL, if given the chance. Meanwhile, Scandinavian countries continued to develop elite players. Jari Kurri, a smooth skating Finn, was drafted by the Edmonton Oilers in the 1980 and quickly became the deadly right-hand man to Gretzky. Kurri's uncanny anticipation and passing sense honed in the wide-open Finnish style and made Edmonton's already lethal offense practically unstoppable. He and fellow Finn, Esa Tikkanen, helped the Oilers win multiple Stanley Cups, proving European players could thrive on hockey's biggest stage. Kurri in particular showed a combination of endurance and vision the NHL simply couldn't match, complementing Gretzky's genius with his own brand of hockey IQ. As one account noted, Kurri's success owed something to playing with legends, but he always knew exactly where his line mates were on the ice, a testament to the awareness he developed in the European style of play. But perhaps the most significant breakthroughs, however, were happening behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union. Throughout the 80s, Canadian fans marveled at Soviet stars like forward Sergei Makarov, Vladimir Krutov, Igor Valerinov, defenseman Vyacheslav Fetisov, and goaltending icon Vladislav Tretiak. These players were legends in international competition, but Cold War politics kept most of them out of the NHL until the decade's end. By the late 80s though, the Soviet stance softened and the floodgates opened. In 1989, Buffalo Sabres GM Gary Meehan managed to get Alexander Mogilny overseas. He was an electrifying young Soviet winger who would become the first USSR player to bowl to the NHL while still in his prime. That same year, Calgary lured Sergei Makarov overseas, and within a couple more seasons, many of the Soviet greats finally arrived in North America. The Berlin Wall fell and the USSR was dissolved in 1991, freeing a whole generation of Eastern European talent to pursue NHL careers. It's hard to overstate how the talent pool of the NHL swelled into the early 1990s, thanks to the European arrivals. Suddenly, superstars who were once confined to Europe were now joining NHL clubs left and right, and they were making a huge impact. A 25-year-old Czech goalie named Dominik Hasek, who had languished as a third stringer in Chicago, was traded to Buffalo in 1992 and promptly became a once-in-a-lifetime netminder, spinning, flopping, and stopping pucks like never seen before. Hasek's unique style and cat-like reflexes, refined in European play, led him to 6 Vezina trophies as the NHL's top goalie, and won 2 league MVP awards, achievements few North American goalies could only dream of. On the offensive side, the list of European stars blossomed. The 1990s became an era dominated by the Finnish, Czech, and Swedish greats. One example of this is in 1990, when the Quebec Nordiques made history by selecting Sweden's gifted forward Mats Sundin as the first ever European #1 overall pick. Sundin would go on to score over 500 goals in his Hall of Fame career. But most importantly, his draft day marked a symbolic end to any reluctance about European phenoms. If a kid from Stockholm was the best available player, then he would be picked above all Canadian kids. The very next year, a 19-year-old Jaromír Jágr arrived from newly free Czechoslovakia to join the Pittsburgh Penguins. He helped Pittsburgh to Stanley Cup championships in 1991 and 92, and eventually claimed 5 NHL scoring titles, bridging the gap from the Gretzky era into the 2000s. Jágr stood 6'3", and unlike the stereotypes, he could not be muscled off the puck. He brought a lethal combination of size and speed, proving a European could be as physically dominant as anyone. In 1992-93, Teemu Selänne, a rookie from Finland's capital city, stunned the hockey world by scoring 76 goals in his debut season, shattering NHL records. His instant success put the long-struggling Winnipeg Jets, formerly of the WHA, back into the spotlight. On the blue line, Sweden's Nicklas Lidström quietly began redefining what an NHL defenseman could be. Lidström wasn't crushing bodies with open-ice hits. Instead, he was using positioning, stick work, and effortless skating to control the game. By the end of the 90s, he was widely considered the best defenseman on the planet. A hybrid who could score when needed, and defend with the best, and of course, lead by example. And let's not forget the Russians. While the 1990s saw slightly fewer Russian superstars than the European wave from Finland, Sweden, and Czechia, that changed around the turn of the millennium. Pavel Bure, the Russian Rocket, became a sensation with his breakout and goal-scoring binges. Then as the 2000s began, a new generation of Russian forwards took over, like Alexander Ovechkin, Evgeny Malkin, all who would soon be mentioned among the greatest of their era. By the 2000s, the transformation was noticeable. What had once been just a few European players in the NHL now turned into over 500 European players that had suited up in the league in that century's final 2 decades. They were stars and fans knew it. In locker room and press boxes, the old chatter about softness were heard less and less, and the stereotypes that once dogged European players were now being buried under an avalanche of achievements. But beyond individual awards, Europeans were reshaping how hockey was played in the NHL. As the number of international players swelled, so did their influence on coaching, strategy, and team dynamics. A pivotal chapter came in the mid-1990s, with one team, the Detroit Red Wings, under coach Scotty Bowman. Detroit assembled the famed Russian Five. Beginning in 1995, Sergei Fedorov, Igor Larinov, Slava Fetisov, Slava Kozlov, and Vladimir Konstantinov regularly took the ice together. No NHL team had tried such a unit before, and the results were stunning. Detroit dominated puck possession to a degree that shocked observers. Bowman later explained, "Everybody used to dump the puck in and chase it. The Russians changed that. They changed our game." And I quote, "Rather than giving up the puck, the Russian Five carried it in with confidence, using weaving breakouts and their incredible passing, which was perfected on big European ice. Opponents looked helpless, and goalie Mike Vernon joked, 'These were the times I could have left the net and gone out for pizza. And the other team still wouldn't have the puck from those guys when I got back.'" Soon, other teams began adopting elements of this approach, and by the 2000s, the NHL as a whole leaned more towards puck possession, speed, control, and skill. It wasn't just the Russians, it was Swedes like Nicklas Lidström who elevated two-way defense, while the Czechs and Finns influenced powerplay design and training methods. The league itself adjusted too. Rule changes in 2005 cracked down on obstruction and abolished the two-line pass, favoring an open, flowing style. Suddenly, finesse was rewarded more than brute force, a shift that left Europeans thrive even further. Acceptance quickly followed. By 2008, Lidström made history as the first European-trained captain to lift the Stanley Cup, with 5 Swedish teammates beside him. Just 3 years later, Zdeno Chara captained Boston to a cup, silencing any doubts about European leadership. Goaltending also transformed. The late 90s and 2000s produced an elite wave. Finland's Kiprusoff, Rask, Pekkarinen, and Sweden's Lundqvist, alongside Russia's Nabokov and Vasilevsky, and of course the Czech unimaginable greats Dobnik Hasek and Tomáš Vakun. By the year 2020, about half the league starters were European, unimaginable in the 1970s. These goalies brought redefined butterfly technique, supreme athleticism, and the positional style that defines a position today. Europe's influence didn't just add flair, it rewrote hockey's DNA. The NHL became a hybrid game, physical when needed, but also creative, fast, possession-driven. But one might ask, how do relatively small European countries produce so many hockey greats? Canada and the United States have far larger player pools, yet per capita basis, nations like Sweden and Finland churn out NHL talent at staggering rates. Well, the answer lies in how Europeans train their youth, often in ways very different to North America. Take Sweden. With just 10 million people, their country boasts 113 NHLers by 2020. This was no accident. In the early 2000s, Swedish hockey leaders overhauled development. They emphasized skill and fun over competition, banning standings and statistics for games under 13. Kids still kept score during games, but nothing was recorded publicly. Coaches gave everyone an equal ice time, allowing late bloomers to catch up. This inclusive approach is way different than in North America, where even 9-year-olds chase trophies and elite programs. But in Sweden and Finland, players aren't rushed. Everyone develops and no child is shut out by the system too early. Another hallmark is creativity. Many European practices mimic pond hockey, with coaches letting kids play small area games, experiment and make mistakes. Whistles are used sparingly, and players learn to read the ice and teammates naturally. The result? Forwards and defensemen who improvise, seeing the game with instinct and being one step ahead. The results speak loudly. Sweden routinely supplies 70 plus NHL players per season and had a record 28 drafted in 2018. Finland, with just 5.5 million people, hit 50 NHL players in 2019-20. By 2019-2020, Europeans made up over 31% of the NHL. They're not just filling rosters, they're leading franchises. Internationally, Europeans have kept pace with North America. Olympic and World Championship medals are spread across Sweden, Finland, Russia, the Czech Republic, and now even small nations like Latvia. In just one generation, the whole narrative has flipped. Europeans, who were once doubted, are now essential to the NHL's identity. Roughly half the draftees come from Europe, and coaches and executives from overseas are beginning to shape the teams as well. The truth is simple. Europeans are good at hockey because they bend love of the game with development models that emphasize skill, creativity, and puck control. North Americans, pushed by this influx, improved their finesse and skating. Europeans, in turn, toughed it up to survive the NHL grind. Together, the two traditions have forged the modern game, which has become faster, smarter, and more beautiful than either style alone. What was once North America's league is now the world's league. The ice has no nationality, and Europe has proven, beyond doubt, that greatness can come from anywhere on the world.